We've been in a sermon series for the last 2 weeks, and today is the conclusion of that series called Fantastic Beasts and How to Face Them. Did anybody go see the second Fantastic Beasts movie this weekend? Sammy, I tell, I know they did. They loved it too, but the sermon series takes its name from that movie about those fantastic beasts, but ours are a little bit different. We've been talking about different kinds of beasts that we need to face as people of faith. 2 weeks ago, we looked at that beast called fear and how to face our own fears. And then last week, we took a look at ego and how we might face our own egos and what the antidote for ego would be. And today, we turn to the fantastic beast called blame. Some of us know that name really well. Pointing to myself. Our reading today is from Matthew's Gospel. It's in the 7th chapter. We're still in parts of the Sermon on the Mount. Each week in this series, there's been a part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And today we hear from Matthew 7, 1 through 5. You'll find that reading on the front of your Grow Pray study guide. And I invite you to follow along as we share in the Word. Jesus is speaking, of course. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. But for with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. When I was a kid, something happened at our house. While my mom and dad were not watching, I don't know where they were, but they were off doing something else important, probably paying bills and cooking dinner. But they weren't watching, and someone in our house took a marker, a permanent marker, and drew a beautiful picture all up and down the wall in our hallway. My mother came and saw me first, and she asked me, who did this? And I pointed down to my sister's room, and I said, Kay. But here's the thing. I was 3, and Kay was an infant. She didn't walk yet. She was still in her crib, and I happened to be holding the magic marker in my hand when I pointed down the room to the hall to her room and said, Kay did it. But you know, neither of those facts, that she was an infant and couldn't walk, or the one where I had the marker in my hand, neither of those things stopped me from laying blame for that piece of artwork squarely on my sister's shoulder. Nothing stopped me from just pushing that blame off onto someone else. And she was convenient. She was, after all, just down the hall. I was only 3 years old. I couldn't have had much real-life experience by that age of learning how to blame others. The only show I watched was Sesame Street, and Big Bird didn't teach how to blame others, so I'm quite sure I didn't learn it from television. I hadn't been to preschool yet. I didn't have any playmates yet to learn that you could blame something on someone else if the teacher caught you doing something wrong, so I didn't learn it from other kids. So it seems to me that this example, it points to the idea that there is something about humanity that just knows how to avoid responsibility, that knows how to point the finger at someone else when we know we've we've done something wrong, we tend to look around for someone else to blame. Call it self-protection if you want to, self-preservation or survival instinct if you like. Some people have called it sin. Some call it original sin as they look at the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and they'll say the sin that Adam and Eve committed was not really taking the fruit and eating it when God told them not to. It was more so pointing the finger at someone else. The snake told me, Eve did it. Pointing that finger at someone else and not taking responsibility for your own actions. Jesus has something to say about it in the Sermon on the Mount. Blame others, passing judgment on others, pointing fingers. It's the pastime of hypocrites. We don't do too much talking about hypocrites, but we all know some, don't we? We all know some. People who put on a false appearance of virtue or righteousness. Young people might call them posers. People might say they're masqueraders. My grandmother would use things like, well, isn't she a little high and mighty? He's all talk and no action, she might say. We all know some, because at least some of the time, we are them. We are them. Most of you know that I am committed, deeply committed to leading camp every summer with our high school age youth in the region. I love going to summer camp with the teenagers. I love it for a lot of reasons. Some is because I'm not scared of teenagers like some people are, so it's easy for me to pack my bag and go live in a hut with some teenagers. I love their energy and their passion, though, as well. They're so passionate about their faith and willing and ready to share that with others. I also love it because I'm no stranger to sarcasm, and they've got a lot to pass around. They're gifted in that area. And youth are mischievous. And they enjoy a good prank from time to time. And I like a good prank from time to time too. But one of the reasons I really never want to miss an opportunity to be at camp in the summer is that I never fail to learn more from the youth than I think I teach them while I'm with them. Maybe about 10 years ago, there was a particular youth from First Christian Church down in Tuscaloosa. He was a real prankster, a fun guy and a funny guy. He had a pretty difficult family situation. And if there was ever a kid who could have blamed his life or his actions on someone else or on his upbringing rather than himself, it was Jackson. Jackson could have done it and gotten away with it. But his best quality was that he never, ever, not once, did I ever see him blame anything on anyone else if he was involved in it. If there was a prank that went wrong, maybe it started out as a good-natured, but, it went a little bit too far. And I had to kind of bring the hammer down and call everybody in together and have what my mother would call a come to Jesus meeting and say, look, this has gone on and we're going to have to figure out what happened here. Every single time, Jackson would come up to the front and he would say, I'm responsible for this, at least in part. I was part of it, and what do I need to do to make it right? He fessed up. But it wasn't just that. When teenagers would be sitting around at free time or in small groups as we had our small group sessions, and someone else might begin to speak judgmentally about another youth, it was always Jackson who would speak up and say, I don't think we ought to be doing that. And it wasn't just that he was defending the person that was being talked about, but he would also remind his peers that he and they also had some not so admirable qualities. And first on that list was the quality of judging other people, instead of offering them love and grace. And so he would call himself out, but he also in love would call out others for speaking in judgmental ways. He would say, my grandmother always said, judge not lest ye be judged. And it's a lesson that I've learned, and I think we all need to follow. I don't know about you, but I find that all too often, I'm the hypocrite that Jesus is talking about in a passage like today's. I'm the one with a log in my eye, but somehow still I feel like I have an ability to point out a splinter in someone else's. Too often, I am the one who wants to have understanding and acceptance come my way. But I'm also slow to offer it to others. Maybe we find this passage so easy to quote and so hard to follow because it's easier to point to someone else's shortcomings than it is for us to raise our own self-awareness, to open our own selves up for examination. It's easier to look at someone else's faults than it is to examine our own faults and shortcomings. It's easier to look at others than it is to bear responsibility ourselves for our actions or our inactions, whatever they may be. And there's no doubt that today's passage, in the passage for today, that Jesus confronts us. He confronts us in our tendency to blame others and in our desire to sit in the judgment seat. But what is the antidote for this judgment that we so easily fall into? What medicine will help us counteract this problem? 2 weeks ago when we talked about fear, we also focused on an antidote for fear, and that was hope. That if, as people of faith, we live in hope, then fear cannot just run rampant in our lives and take over our lives. And last week when we talked about ego, we discovered that an antidote for ego is gratitude. And that the more we live our lives in thankfulness, the less our ego has an opportunity to get out of control. What's the antidote for blame? For judgment? I think it's grace. I think it is amazing, amazing grace. Grace is a word we talk about a lot and we sing about, but you know, it might be surprising to learn that Jesus didn't preach or teach about grace by using the word grace. He didn't say in the Gospels, extend grace to your brothers and sisters. He didn't teach grace by talking about it because Jesus is grace embodied. Jesus is God's grace walking around on the earth in flesh. And so his teaching about grace is done in action. He eats with outcasts. He heals those who are deemed unworthy. He breaks the rules in order to bring new life to people who need new life. It's Jesus' pattern of living. That when we look at it, what we see is grace. That's how we learn how to live grace our own selves. It's how we learn to embody grace in our lives. But the problem with grace, as the Pharisees like to point out, is that it is not fair. Grace is not fair. We like to live in systems of deservedness. Someone gets a bonus paycheck at their work. Why do they get it? because they worked extra hard and they deserved to get it. My grandparents didn't do this, and I was envious of other people's grandparents who did, but some grandparents will give you $20 for every A you get on your report card because you deserve that money if you get that good grade. Grace, we tend to think, even if we don't say it out loud because we're kind of taught to think it, grace should be earned. That's the way it should be. Fred Craddock, the beloved disciples preacher, tells a story about being asked to teach a Sunday school class at a church he was visiting, and they were talking about the forgiving father, or how we know it as the prodigal son sometimes. And he wondered if anybody was really awake, and that story is so well known. He decided to tell it a little bit different way to see if they were paying attention, and so he started out just by telling the basic story. A dad had two sons, and one son came to him and said, "Give me my half of my inheritance," and he went off and ran wild in town and hung out with the wrong people and made all the bad decisions, and he had to pay for it. The other son stayed home, went to work in his father's fields, and did what he was supposed to do. Well, after a little while, the son who went off and squandered his life and all of the inheritance came home with his tail tucked between his legs. He came limping on home, and his father saw him way off in the distance. He ran out to greet him, and he brought him back in to the family estate, and then he called his servants and he said, "Go out and kill the fatted calf, and we're going to have a big party. Because I want this son here to see that the party is for the son who stayed at home and did what he was supposed to do." And a lady way in the back of the classroom that morning said, "That's the way it should have been written." We want grace to be conditional. You should have to deserve it. Bob Gaff says, "Grace is not fair unless you're the one who needs a little bit of it." Grace, it turns everything upside down. It's not something that any of us, no matter how hard we work, can earn for ourselves. It is not something that is deserved. Grace is offered. It's offered where it's not warranted. It's given out because it is what God has chosen. Chosen for all of us. Grace is given, and it is what we are called to give because it's the way of Jesus, the living embodiment of grace. And therefore, grace is the way of those who call ourselves followers of Jesus. To follow Jesus, to be a Christian, means that we learn to live in a way that Jesus calls us to live in this upside down kind of way. Some of you know the writer Anne Lamott, the Christian writer. She's a wonderful woman, and she has said in the past that she's not the kind of Christian who's heavy into forgiveness and things like that. She's one of the other kind, she says. But when she says it, it's a joke. Because there is no other kind of Christian. To be Christian is to extend grace to others, even when it's not warranted or deserved. When we live with an attitude of grace toward others, we are much less likely to fall into that pattern of trying to see splinters in other people's eyes while we have logs in our own. We're less likely to live in blame and judgment. Grace is what allows us to remove that log from our own eyes, to recognize that we ourselves are in the same need as other people, because we all fall short and are in need of grace. blind, but now I see. Amazing grace. It does have a sweet sound. I think it's in living that we are set free to love others as we have been loved and to offer that amazing grace that has already been offered to us. Would you pray with me? Gracious and grace-filled God, you offer us grace when we clearly don't deserve it. You sent your Son to show us how to live in grace. And so we pray this morning that you would give us the strength. Give us the wherewithal. Give us the determination to remove the logs from our eyes so that we may clearly see the way that you would have us live. Gathered in your grace, may we extend grace to others in the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen.